Maybe you can just throw the question at me and I'll just have a long time to think and prepare and be extremely eloquent.
That says that a big chunk of the health funding today was announced last year, and it essentially just deals with the generic cost of breaches. So in terms of getting elective surgeries and wait times down for specialist appointments, how do you suppose addressing that if most of the funding was announced last year and only keeps the lights on?
Well, because those are real dollars that will lead to more surgery, more specialist appointments, more people getting the health care they need in a more timely way. We made a historic decision at last year's budget that instead of making the health system wait till each budget to find out what funding increase it would get, we gave them certainty and we said this is what you'll get at each budget, and I'm proud that we've kept those commitments even while New Zealand has gone through tough economic times. And so the health system has had a funding increase that goes beyond what is required just for population growth. We've also, of course, done that new package all about getting people better access to their GP, longer prescription periods, better after-hours care, better medicines from Pharmac. So we're investing in the health system, a real priority in this budget.
Is that outcome to the health system? Does that actually, is it going to make a dent in the deficit, the cost pressure?
Yes, it will, because that additional funding will mean that they have more resources for meeting the costs that they face, for employing nurses, doctors, specialists, for delivering surgery. The other thing, of course, that we're doing that's really important in the health budget is a $1 billion boost to health infrastructure, rebuilding hospitals and facilities. That makes a difference to Health New Zealand, obviously, because there's a better place for people to work, but often that reduces the costs of delivering health services when you've got a more sensible space. You know, you think about the Wellington Emergency Department. One of the challenges to doctors and nurses looking after patients there in a timely way is that their space is constrained. So when we build better facilities, we also allow our healthcare workers to work more efficiently.
So how does that on KiwiSaver? So there seems to be a lot of support for these tax changes that have been announced for the investment boost. Changing the contribution rate, so we've got contribution rate, is an added cost for businesses. Why is that justified?
Well, because we think it's going to help New Zealand workers save more, both for their first home and for retirement. And we acknowledge that because we're asking employers to match employees dollar for dollar and to give a bit more than they currently do, that's something businesses will have to plan for. That's why the change isn't happening until 1 April next year, and why we're phasing it in over 3 years. So up 0.5% next year, and then another couple of years it comes up to 4%. But the result will be good for New Zealand, because when New Zealanders have more savings, they have more financial security, and we know that a significant proportion of KiwiSaver funds are invested here in New Zealand assets and New Zealand financial products, and so that's good for the country as a whole. Because we want KiwiSaver to be fiscally sustainable, and the reality is we were borrowing every single dollar that we were putting into people's savings accounts, and we cannot be a country that borrows forever. We need to get our books back in balance. We think KiwiSaver can still be a really good scheme without having as big a government contribution.
It does make Australia look more attractive though, because they do.
Oh, well, no, in Australia, superannuation is means tested. In New Zealand, we have universal superannuation for everyone, no matter their financial circumstances, and then KiwiSaver is an additive on top of that. And of course, in Australia, people are required to contribute a lot more to their personal savings than is required here in New Zealand. Look, there's no question. Picking between New Zealand and Australia, pick New Zealand every time.
Businesses who are having to shoulder more costs because of that KiwiSaver contribution turn around and say, well, can't afford to pay rise this year.
Well, look, we acknowledge that employers and employees will work that through together, and how that's managed will vary from business to business depending on their circumstances. Overall, this is why we care so much about economic growth, because we know that when employers are doing better, they are better able to pay their workers more. And with the investment boost policy, the advice we received was the people who will benefit the most from that tax incentive are actually workers, because it will allow more jobs to be created and people to be paid more. You can actually see it here at this business. When they invest in new machinery and technology and they become more efficient, they can produce more, they can hire more people. When they're doing better, they want to pay their staff more. And I believe that New Zealand employers want to do the best for their staff. They want to see them having good retirement savings. They want to see them paid well. But the best thing we can do as a government is create a growing economy so that those businesses can be doing well and are able to make those contributions.
Treasury advice on that investment goes also talked about how it would bring foreign investment into New Zealand. In fact, I think it almost paper being higher than domestic company. I mean, what is that component of?
Well, it will be a really good incentive for every small business, tradie, farmer, manufacturer, anyone who wants to buy equipment in New Zealand. What the advice from our officials highlighted is that compared to other countries, we have a very difficult tax system when it comes to making investments in a business. So you're right, the advice said this will make New Zealand a more attractive place for investors from elsewhere in the world to come and invest in New Zealand businesses, because they'll face a lower cost of capital and they'll see bigger returns. That's a positive thing. If people want to invest in New Zealand businesses so that they can grow, so they can hire more people, then I think that's a positive thing. So I'm glad that this tax policy will encourage that.
And just back to KiwiSaver, you mentioned yesterday that the Treasury actually advised you to not do it at all. Those conversations, did you really consider that?
Yeah, look, we've published the regulatory impact statement on that so people can read the advice for themselves. But look, the advice from our officials was that there isn't good evidence that that government subsidy has led to New Zealanders choosing to save more. And so looking at the books as a whole, they said this is an area where we think you could make a saving. I think we've taken a balanced approach, which is saying let's keep a bit of that government money going in to encourage people to go into KiwiSaver and to keep them there, but let's make it more affordable in the longer run. I think we struck the right balance. It specifically delivers the growing economy on which your job and your income and your financial security depends. Because if we want to be able to invest in the health services, the education services that middle income families rely on, then this needs to be a country with a strong growing economy. In these past few years, we have not had that. We've had high inflation, high interest rates, very low growth, and it has hurt Kiwi families. They've been managing a cost of living that has been too high. They've watched the government build up its own debt, get into serious deficit, and that has worried a lot of people. This budget says to everyone who's been going through that cost of living crisis, things are getting better. This is going to be a faster growing economy with inflation under control. Your income's going to be rising and your government is going to be investing in the things you care about without racking up too much debt. No, that's not at all the phrase that I would use. It's making sure that everyone has a stake in New Zealand's success, and it's doing that in a prudent and responsible way, because I think New Zealanders are smart enough to know that we can't just keep whacking everything on the credit card and hoping for the best. We need to make sure we're managing our finances sustainably.
18 to 19-year-olds with regards to the documentary. How come you haven't sort of looked at the threshold the threshold?
Well, look, our intention is very clear. Essentially, we want the message to every 18 and 19-year-old to be, we expect you to either be in work or in training. We don't want you on welfare. And so to reinforce that message, we are going to say to parents that we expect that you will be responsible for supporting your teenager in most circumstances. But we realise there'll be some exceptions where, for a range of different reasons, those young people might not be able to get any support from their parents. And so what we want to do is define very carefully what those circumstances are. We want to work through that because, on the one hand, you don't want the exclusions so wide that the policy doesn't achieve what it's setting out to achieve, which is fewer people receiving a benefit as a teenager. But on the other hand, we don't want to make sure that people end up in really, really difficult circumstances. Because Cabinet is going to make those deliberations in the next few months, but what we wanted to be clear in this budget about was that's a policy that we will be bringing out, and we will be making savings from that policy as well.
For those young people, they need motivation.
My message is you have a great future in New Zealand, so actually get out there, do some training, get a job, have hope and aspiration for yourself. A life on welfare is minimising your potential. You can do better, and we believe you, we want to back you, and actually New Zealand is a better place to live if you're working or you're training or you're aspiring for something more.
Yeah, so there is already an estimate of how many people might be affected by this.
Well, that's an estimate that obviously MSD have formed based on their assumptions around how the policy might work, and we'll finalise the details and we'll announce those and make it clear. I don't have that number on me.
The participants yesterday sort of quibbled about the infrastructure investment in the budget and made out that it was lesser than...
Was there anything he didn't quibble about?
Well,
I think Labor need to stop being so negative.
It's also the job of the opposition, I think. I think you'll remember that frame of mind. Suggesting it was lesser than prior budgets in terms of the quantum of infrastructure announcement. I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, I mean, the capital allowance at this year's budget was topped up to $4 billion, actually higher than what was forecast at the half-year update about 6 months ago. So there's significant new infrastructure investments in the budget. The most notable of which, of course, is $1 billion for health infrastructure. Wellington, Nelson Hospitals announced yesterday. Those are significant investments that have been very widely and warmly welcomed by those communities. There's huge new investment into school property where we're making real gains. Bit of an untold story actually, where from memory around 60 to 70% of school property, new school classrooms are now being delivered by modular off-site manufacturers, including here in the Hutt Valley actually. So we're making significant efficiency gains there, and there's a big new investment that Erica Stanford's put together into school property. So there's big new infrastructure investments, obviously funding of Christchurch Men's Prison as well. But these things, you can't do everything all in one budget. So ultimately it's about building up a sustainable pipeline of infrastructure investments. And if you look at the release I put out on Tuesday from the Infrastructure Commission, it notes that there's over $206.9 billion in the forward pipeline of infrastructure expenditure across the economy. Now that's partly the public infrastructure pipeline that the government funds itself, but also what the private sector is doing in terms of infrastructure like energy as well. So infrastructure is a very important part of the New Zealand economy. There's a big pipeline of work into the future. The government's going to step up and play its role, but you can't do everything all in one budget.
The sector's crying out for a bit of sort of stimulatory infrastructure activity in advance of the budget. I mean, do you think this is...
Well, there is big investments going in. I mean, Melling here is a $1.5 billion project. It's starting later in the year. In the budget, we put a couple $100 million into the East Coast and Hawke's Bay councils for their response to severe weather events. That's money into local road resilience. That's underway now. It's further funding that'll get on top of that. There's money into the rail network that's on top of what we put in last year's budget. That is renewal work and maintenance work where there are people out on the tracks doing that. Literally right now and into the next few years. There's projects all around the country. Brougham Street's about to get underway down south, which is a very important road connecting Littleton Port into Christchurch. The roads of national significance. There's early works underway on many of those projects around the place. There's a record investment in the transport budget through the National Land Transport Program that we finalised last year. That's underway right now. So, people always want to do more, but as the Minister of Finance has rightly said, you've got to balance different things. But there is undoubtedly a massive infrastructure investment series of projects happening right now.
Is Labor correct when it says that around $1 billion in Māori funding is
No, I completely reject that. In fact, you will see that there is a very specific initiative in Māori education. We are continuing to fund Māori health services, and we're creating a flexible housing fund that in some cases will give Māori providers more access to housing funds to do the housing developments they want, and will also deliver, we think, more housing for whānau, including Māori whānau.
Labor was investing in specifically targeted Māori.
Well, Labor had allowed a proliferation of different grants and different funds, and rather than having lots of different systems, we're trying to have a more coherent, joined-up approach. I'll actually let Bush...
Lots of different funds are a coherent system, but question is not just in housing but overall.
Well, across all spending, we've been upfront. In this budget, the approach we've taken is what are the priority investments we need to make, what are the savings we can make, and how do we make it add up? Because the thing that's different between us and Labor is we actually don't want to burden the next generation with a huge pile of debt and additional taxes. What that means for Māori is that we are very focused on delivering the services and outcomes that Māori communities have a right to expect. That's good health services, that's really good schools for our kids, including building more kura kaupapa. That's about more housing, including housing delivered by iwi and for Māori whānau, making sure that we do that in a way that makes sense.
It also means there is
Take housing, for example. One of the ways we can deliver better support for Māori families in social housing on the wait list is by doing the flexible fund that we've created in the budget. So if you take the social housing wait list, it's actually come down 6,000 or so in the last 18 months, but there's around 19,000 families. I don't have the exact numbers to hand, but a good chunk of those families will be Māori whānau around the country. We want them into warm and dry homes. The flexible fund we're creating will better target the needs of the people on the wait list. It will better target the regional needs of particular families around the country, and it will target individual needs and make sure we're building the right houses in the right places. 60% of people on that register need a one-bedroom unit. Kāinga Ora only has 12% of its stock, around 75,000 units. 12% of that are one-bedroom units. So we are deliberately redesigning the system to be far more particular and deliberate about what the government purchases in terms of housing outcomes and where. That opens up an enormous capacity for iwi and for existing Māori housing providers around the country to partner with us, to use their land, for us to contribute some operating funding or potentially some capital funding on top of the land that they often bring to the table, to build houses for whānau in need. And I'll just give you one other thing. Papakāinga housing, I'm a firm believer in. There is huge potential for that around the country, and later this week you will see us make announcements about making it easier to build papakāinga around the country, which is a big part of the solutions for Māori housing.
finally on the prescriptions, 3 months to 12 months. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, we want to make it easier for New Zealanders to get timely health care, and we've spoken to parents and other people with high health needs who say having to go back to the GP every 3 months, not only is that expensive, it's time consuming, it's a hassle, and we know many patients just end up not doing that. So by having this 12-month policy, we think more people will be able to get their medicine in a reliable way with less cost and less hassle.
Okay, thank you.
Right, thanks.
Thank you.
God, my feet like numb.
I know.